fellow, he was, I don't know if he was a conscript or he wasn't a regular soldier. I liked him, but unusual sort of chap. He said, I can't stick this, he said. He said, I'd sooner be dead than stick this. So anyway, one morning, there was a hell of an explosion back of my trench. He put his hand under the steel helmet and put a Mills's bomb on top and blew his hand off. Lost his arm. He'd gone down from the bay, round the back of the trench, and we was in the trench, you see, and he put his hand put his hand on top of it, put his helmet on top of that, and pulled a pin out of the Mills's bomb and blew his hand off. I don't know what happened to him. I know he's only about 22.
June 2nd, 1916, Ypres Salient, Belgium. 6 o'clock in the morning, just dawn. In the frontline trenches of the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, positions numbered 47 to 53 in front of Armagh Wood, on the right flank of the 8th Canadian Brigade. The day is beginning the way most days begin in the salient. Stand 2 has come and gone. The men are checking weapons, eating whatever passes for breakfast, doing the small habitual things that soldiers do to impose routine on a situation that has none. 2 senior officers walk into the trench. Major General Malcolm Mercer, commanding the 3rd Canadian Division, Brigadier General Victor Williams, commanding the 8th Brigade. They've come forward at first light to reconnoiter the ground, or to look at Tortop and Mount Sorrel with their own eyes, to understand the position, to plan what comes next. They are doing exactly the kind of forward inspection that Lieutenant General Julian Byng, newly arrived as Canadian Corps Commander, has asked of them. It is the worst possible morning to be in that trench. To the north, in Sanctuary Wood, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry hold the line under their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Cecil Buller. To the south, beyond the 1st CMR on the 4th's left, the 5th Battalion of the 1st Canadian Division holds the right flank. In brigade support at Maple Copse, a few hundred meters back, the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles are standing to under Lieutenant Colonel G.H. Baker. All of them are minutes away from the worst day of their lives. At 6 o'clock, exactly when Mercer and Williams reach the 4th CMR's forward trench, the German preliminary bombardment opens. This is not harassing fire. It's not a slow build. Lord Beaverbrook, who would later compile the official Canadian record, called it, quote, the heaviest endured by British troops up to that time, end quote. This is the Canadian Corps' first encounter with the kind of artillery preparation that the summer of 1916 will make routine. For 4 hours, a tornado of fire rakes the Canadian positions from west of Mont Sorel to the northern edge of Sanctuary Wood. The 4th CMR's trenches simply vanish. Of 702 officers and men in the 4th CMR's forward position, only 76 come through unscathed. 89% casualties. A German officer, looking across what they had done, would later write that the Canadian position was, quote, a cloud of dust and dirt into which timber, tree trunks, weapons, and equipment were continuously hurled up, and occasionally human bodies, end quote. There is a gallery dug into the reverse slope of Mont Sorel by the 2nd Canadian Tunnelling Company. The men who built it called it the tunnel. It offers some shelter as long as it holds. Eventually, it doesn't. When the tunnel is blown in, its surviving occupants, including a wounded Brigadier General Williams, are captured. Mercer doesn't make it back either. His eardrums are shattered by a near shell burst. A bullet breaks his leg as he tries to reach safety. As he lies on the ground in the open, a burst of shrapnel eventually kills him. The most senior Canadian officer killed in action in any war Canada has fought. Then, a few minutes after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, 4 enormous mines explode just short of the obliterated Canadian front line. The Württemberg infantry come over the top in bright sunlight, 4 waves spaced 75 yards apart, advancing at leisurely pace because they've been told, and they believe, that nothing on the other side could possibly still be alive. Mostly they are right. They flow over what's left of the trenches on Montsorel and Tortop almost unopposed, but not entirely. There are isolated bands of survivors, knots of men from the 1st and 4th CMR who lived through the 4-hour tornado and are still in the wreckage with rifles and bayonets and bombs. Hand to hand, bay to bay, the kind of fighting that doesn't appear on any operational map. And here is what the Württembergers do where these isolated pockets refuse to break. They use flame projectors. Not as the leading edge of the assault, not in massed rows. The infantry's already broken in. The mines and the artillery have already done the heavy work. The flamethrowers come after, directed by German pioneer teams against the resistant points that won't yield to bayonet and grenade, into dugout entrances, into surviving bays, into the places where Canadians are still fighting back. This is the moment. Early afternoon on June 2nd, 1916, on the slopes of Montsorel and Tortop, when the men of the 1st and 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles and the PPCLI possibly became the first soldiers of the Canadian Expeditionary Force to face liquid fire in combat. Now, I say possibly because in the chaos of shattered trenches and broken lines, some accounts, most notably the official history by G.W.L. Nicholson, suggests that German assault troops brought forward flame projectors, not in sweeping waves, not as a battle-winning weapon, but in these desperate close-quarter moments where bomb and bayonet weren't enough. And yet the record is uneven. The diaries are quiet. The reports are sparse, leaving us with a question that still lingers over Montsorel. Were the flames truly there, or are we seeing the memory of fear itself? To quote G.W. Nicholson in his official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the men in the first line had fixed bayonets and carried hand grenades and wire cutters. Those who followed were equipped with entrenching tools, floorboards, and sandbags. As they flowed over the flattened trenches along Montsorel and Tortop, they encountered only small isolated bands of survivors from the 1st and 4th CMR who could offer little effective resistance. There were brief episodes of hand-to-hand fighting with bomb and bayonet, and where sheer numbers were not sufficient to overcome resistance, the enemy used flame projectors. The machine guns of Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry and the 5th Battalion, 1st Division on the left and right flanks raked the attackers. Though they inflicted substantial casualties, they could not halt the advance." End quote. So they're not standing by to be processed by it. They're fighting in the wreckage of a position that has just been pulverized for 7 hours, and they keep fighting until the fire reaches them. This is the story of that weapon, where it came from, how it was built, how it was used, and what the Canadians who faced it had to do to survive. Welcome to the 27th episode of Memory and Valor, a podcast that resurrects the sacrifices of Canadian veterans and soldiers in the First World War. I'm your host, Samantha McRae. Thanks for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. If history like this matters to you, please consider visiting the webpage buymeacoffee.com and simply searching for my page, Memory and Valor, and submitting a donation via buying me a coffee. It would be very much appreciated, and it always really helps to keep this podcast going. Now on with the show. So, flamethrowers in 1916, what the Germans called Flammenwerfer, weren't the cinematic walls of fire we tend to imagine. They were specialist weapons carried by assault pioneers in small teams and already proven in places like Second Battle of Ypres in 1915. A typical set was heavy and awkward, so try to imagine there were twin fuel cylinders and a propellant tank strapped to a man's back, and that fed a hose and nozzle, so when fired, it projected a short, violent jet of burning fuel, usually effective out to about 20 meters, sometimes a bit more, under ideal conditions. They weren't designed for open battle. They were problem solvers, if you think of it that way. So think places like dugouts, traverses, machine gun posts that refuse to go quiet. In those tight and close spaces, a flamethrower didn't need to kill to be effective. The blast of the heat and the sudden ignition, the choking smoke, it could force men out of cover almost instantly, and that's where it earned its reputation. But they came at a cost. And I want to back up for a second and just think about the psychological aspect of a flamethrower coming at you, never mind the heat, the sudden ignition, and the choking smoke. There's just this innate fear of fire that I think every single human being has. And seeing, a jet of liquid fire would be absolutely paralyzing psychologically. So when I say they came at a cost, you think of it this way. The operator was actually a walking target. The fuel tanks were vulnerable, so if the operator was hit by a bullet or shrapnel, the result could obviously be catastrophic, and because of that, they were used sparingly. They were only brought forward when bomb and bayonet just weren't enough. Now, before we get into the weapon itself, I want to spend a few minutes on the problem it was trying to solve, because understanding the why is what separates military history from a list of dates and hardware. So by the end of 1914, the Western Front had done something nobody predicted and almost nobody planned for. It had stopped moving. The great German advance through Belgium and France had been checked at the Marne. Both sides have tried to outflank each other, the race to the sea, and instead of flanking anyone, they've extended the line all the way to the English Channel. And then they've dug in. What you have now, stretching roughly 700 kilometers from the Swiss border to the coast of Flanders, is a continuous fortified system. Frontline, support, reserve, connected by communication trenches, protected by wire, covered by machine guns, and backed by artillery. It's an enormous defense advantage for both sides simultaneously, and that creates a tactical paradox that will define the next 4 years. The question every tactical thinker on both sides is wrestling with, constantly, obsessively, is how do you actually break into a trench? The standard answer keeps failing. Mass infantry assault behind artillery preparation keeps running into the same problem. The barrage announces the attack. The defenders go underground. The barrage lifts. The defenders come back up, and the advancing infantry crossing open ground gets cut apart before it reaches the wire. But here's a piece of the problem that doesn't get enough attention. Getting into the enemy trench is only half of it, because a trench system is designed to be defended from inside as well as from in front. Machine guns fire down traverses. Grenadiers work bay to bay. A small number of determined defenders using the geometry of the trench itself can hold off a much larger force for a dangerous amount of time. Every minute you're fighting inside the trench is a minute the defenders' reserves are moving up. What every attacking force needs is something that can clear a trench fast, something that denies cover, something that doesn't give the defender time to respond, something that removes the geometry advantage of the trench itself. The Germans find their answer in fire. Quick thing before we go any further. The Germans didn't invent the idea of throwing fire at people. Not even close. The deep ancestor of the flamethrower as we know it is Greek fire, a Byzantine weapon from the 7th century, traditionally credited to the Syrian-born architect named Kallinikos of Heliopolis, who turned up in Constantinople around 668 CE with a recipe nobody else had. Pressurized petroleum projected through bronze siphon tubes mounted on the prows of Byzantine warships. It burned on water. It couldn't be put out by conventional means. It saved Constantinople from Arab siege fleets repeatedly over the next 2 centuries. We still don't know exactly what was in it. The Byzantines guarded the recipe that closely. They even built a handheld version called the hand siphon, which is functionally a portable flamethrower, 1,200 years before Richard Feidler ever patented his. So when we get to the Western Front in 1914, this isn't the invention of fire as a weapon. This is its industrialization. An idea that ancient meaning, modern engineering, modern chemistry, and modern doctrine. The Byzantines understood the principle perfectly. What changed was the ability to make it portable, reliable, and mass produced. Which brings us to the two men who did the modernizing, and they could not have been more different. The first is Richard Feidler, Berlin engineer, methodical, inventive, the kind of man who thinks in pressures and nozzle diameters. Around 1900, he starts working on a practical pressurized device for projecting burning liquid. By 1901, he's submitting prototypes to the German army. What he builds really is elegant. It's a vertical cylinder divided horizontally. So you had pressure gas below, flammable oil above. You pull on a lever, and the gas forces the oil through a hose, over an igniting wick, and out the nozzle. 18 meters of range, black smoke pouring off the flame. By 1911, the German army has accepted it into service and stood up a regiment of 12 companies. The weapon exists. It works. The question is whether anyone knows what to do with it. So enter the second father, Bernard Redeman. Redeman is not an engineer. He's a Landwehr officer, a reservist. And in civilian life, he's the chief fire officer of Leipzig. That's the detail that matters. This man has spent his career thinking about fire, how it moves, how it spreads, how you control it, and if you really wanted to, how you could turn it on someone. He's been quietly researching fire weapons since 1907. When the war breaks out, Redeman goes back into uniform and he finds a German army that has flamethrowers, but has no idea how to use them. There's the first attempt in 1914. We'll get to that in a moment. And it goes badly enough that the German High Command actually withdraws the weapon from frontline service. They've been treating it as siege equipment. The doctrine isn't there, the training isn't there. The results, in the polite language of military reports, are relatively ineffectual. But Redeman sees what they're missing. The problem isn't the weapon. The problem is how they're thinking about it. The flamethrower isn't a siege tool, it's an assault weapon, and its real power isn't physical destruction, though it does plenty of that. Its real power is what it does to a man's mind. Pure engineers miss this. Redeman doesn't. He understands that the sight of liquid fire coming at a defender, the sound, the heat, the impossibility of it, produces a kind of panic nothing else in the German arsenal can match. A panicked defender can't return fire, can't think, can't hold his ground. He runs or he freezes. Either way, the assault gets through. On January 18th, 1915, Redeman finally gets the resources to prove it. 48 pioneer specialists, many recruited straight out of Germany's fire brigades. These men know fire, and they're about to bring it to the trenches. Before we move on, what are these men actually carrying? Because the tactics only make sense if you understand the hardware. So there were really two weapons. The Klein Flammenwerfer, or the Klein Flammenwerfer, also known as the Kleef, is the backpack version. It's portable. It takes 2 men to operate, 18 meters of range, 20 seconds of fuel. Designed to go into the trench with the assault teams and clear it bay by bay, dugout by dugout. And then there's the Grossflammenwerfer. It's something else entirely. This is a massive fixed installation buried in a forward sap, pushed as close to the enemy as possible the night before an attack. Its range is up to 40 meters, and its job isn't to follow the assault. Its job is to start it, force the defenders down, create the window the assault teams need to cross no man's land. How Redeman's men use them depends on the operation. Sometimes the big projectors lead, and sometimes the Kleef teams move with the infantry. Sometimes, as we'll see at Montsorel, the flame comes after the assault, burning out the men who refused to give up the trench. Different problems, different applications, but the underlying logic is always the same. Combined arms, small scale, fast, violent, designed to compress the defender's decision-making to nothing. So I want to talk about the false start. And here's something worth pausing on. So before Reutemann's unit fires a single shot, before the Adaptation even exists on paper, there's already a first attempt at using fire weapons on the Western Front. In October 1914, in the Argonne Forest sector, which is dense, difficult woodland on the Franco-German frontier, German pioneer units deploy some form of pressurized fire weapon against French positions. The exact details are murky. This is October 1914. The front is still very fluid, and record-keeping is chaotic, and the attack is described variously as a petrol spray ignited by a bomb or as an early Flammenwerfer deployment. What the sources agree on is that it happens, that it targets French troops, and that it's confined to a single sector, and that it goes largely unreported. More importantly, it doesn't work well enough to really matter. The German High Command draws a reasonable, if short-sighted, conclusion. Pull the weapon back. The range is too short, the fuel supply is too limited, the operators are too exposed. In the chaos of open fighting in 1914, the tactical conditions for using it properly don't yet exist. But here's the thing. The Western Front is about to stop moving. The trenches are about to freeze the war in place. And the tactical problem that makes the flamethrower irrelevant in open warfare, the need to be close to your enemy, is about to become a permanent condition of the battlefield. When the front lines are 50 meters apart or sometimes much less, 18 meters of range is suddenly very useful indeed. Reutemann sees this immediately. The weapon didn't fail, the doctrine failed, and he's going to fix that. All right, the Flammenwerfer Abteilung Reutemann makes its combat debut on February 26, 1915, in the Verdun sector against French position near the village of Malancourt. It's a small-scale operation. It's a focused, deliberate attack on a specific section of French trench, the kind of limited assault that wouldn't normally merit more than a paragraph in a unit war diary. But this one is different because Reutemann's men are using the weapon properly for the first time in this war. The Gross Flammenwerfer initiates the assault. The Cleef teams go in with the pioneers. The French position is overrun. The results, from the German perspective, are exactly what Reutemann has been arguing for. He is given what he's been asking for, permission to expand. Within weeks, the Abteilung is growing into something larger, the 3rd Guard Pioneer Battalion, developing under the patronage of Crown Prince Wilhelm into the primary flamethrower unit of the German army on the Western Front. By April 1915, Reutemann's force has multiple companies, dozens of weapons, and an increasingly refined tactical doctrine. For the French, Malancourt is a sharp introduction to something new, but it's local, and it doesn't immediately rewrite Allied thinking about the threat. The rewrite is coming, though, 5 months later. So now I want you to picture the Ypres salient in the summer of 1915. A bulge in the Allied line. It's kind of a shallow curve of territory around the Belgian city of Ypres. It's held by British and Dominion forces, pressed on 3 sides by German-held high ground. The Germans can fire into it from multiple angles. Every road in and out is observed and targeted. The ground is already beginning to take on the waterlogged, shell-churned character that will make it synonymous with horror in the memory of this war. The Canadians know this ground intimately. The 1st Canadian Division has fought its defining battles here just a few months earlier, 2nd Ypres. April and May 1915, that's where the Canadians held the line in the face of the first large-scale gas attack of the war. They lost thousands of men doing it. And then they stayed because that's the salient. You defend it because Ypres is politically and symbolically irreplaceable. And you pay for that in blood continuously. So by the summer of 1915, Canadian units are still holding sections of the salient. Among those units holding their section in the line near Ypres are the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. The PPCLI know this ground. They've been in and around this sector. They're close enough to what happens at Hooge on July 30th, 1915 to understand, immediately, viscerally, exactly what it means. Hooge, that's spelled H-O-O-G-E. It's a château, a crater, a set of trenches. It's just a few kilometers east of Ypres. And in the summer of 1915, the front lines here are extraordinarily close. In some places, barely 4.5 meters apart. You could throw a grenade into the German trench without much effort. The Germans have spent weeks preparing. Their pioneer teams have pushed a sap to within very close range of the British line. Under cover of darkness, they've buried their Gross Flammenwerfer installations. They have synchronized everything. A mine to open the attack, the fixed flame projectors, the assault teams with their portable units, the follow-on infantry. This is Reutemann's tactical doctrine, executed exactly as designed. So now it's 3:15 in the morning, July 30th, 1915. A large German mine detonates under the British front line. The explosion reshapes the ground, creates a new crater, obliterates a section of the British trench. In the seconds of shock that follow, the Gross Flammenwerfer installations open up simultaneously. 2 or more jets of burning oil, horizontal and roaring, hit the front trench. The defenders, the 2nd Battalion Rifle Brigade, along with elements of the 8th Rifle Brigade and 7th King's Royal Rifle Corps of the 14th Light Division, are facing something their training has not prepared them for. The German assault teams cross, the Cleef units go to work in the trench, and the British line breaks. Now, here's the tactical breakdown worth understanding. The reason Hooge works so completely is not just the fire itself, it's the tempo. The suppression was total enough and the assault was fast enough that the British had no time to reach for the standard defensive toolkit. Lateral fire from flanking positions, grenade work, organized withdrawal to secondary line. The flamethrower had compressed the defenders' decision-making timeline to almost zero. The casualties are devastating. 31 officers and 751 other ranks in 2 days of fighting. British after-action reports are blunt and urgent. This weapon must be understood, must be countered, and, by the inevitable logic of this war, must eventually be replicated. For the PPCLI in the salient, Hooge is not a distant event. It's a warning, filed carefully and personally, about what this weapon does and what it takes to survive it. The full Canadian reckoning with the weapon is still 11 months away. Mr. Harry Patch was a Lewis gunner with the 7th Battalion, Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. He fought at Passchendaele in 1917, the same mud, the same craters, the same nightmare landscape the Canadian Corps inherited that October. Harry was obviously with the British Expeditionary Force. He was wounded on September 22nd by a shell that killed 3 of his crew. He came home, and then for the next 80 years, he refused to talk about any of it, not to his family and not to anyone. He started talking finally when he was 100 years old. By the time he died at the age of 111 in 2009, Harry Patch was the last British soldier alive who had fought in the trenches of the First World War. So here's Patch and his feelings about war.
And if any man tells you he ever went to France and went in the front line and tell you he didn't, he wasn't scared, then he's a damn liar. I think every man that went in the front line at some time or another was scared. I know I was. And I know when it came to the point when we went into action, really, I was scared stiff because I thought the first time over the top, you don't know how you're long going to live. That's it.
So let's just step back for a moment and think about who the Canadians are at this point in the war, because context matters enormously when we get to June of 1916. And I want you to think about what Harry Patch said about fear. By early in 1916, the CEF has been in France and Flanders for over a year. The 1st Canadian Division has been fighting continuously. The 2nd Division has arrived and entered the line. The 3rd Division, the one that will bear the full weight of what's coming, has just formed and is still finding its footing. The 4th Division is still being assembled in England. These are mostly volunteers. These are men who came from farms in Saskatchewan, sawmills in British Columbia, law offices in Toronto, Montreal. They brought with them enormous energy and initiative and, frankly, a civilian's instinct to question unnecessary hierarchy, which would become both a challenge for their officers and one of their greatest tactical strengths. They adapt fast, they learn fast, but they've absorbed staggering casualties. 2nd Ypres cost the 1st Division roughly 6,000 men. Festubert and Givenchy added thousands more. The Canadians know what this war is. They have no illusions left about it being short or clean or glorious. What they have is a grim, professional determination to do the job and try to look after the man beside them. There's one detail from January 1916 that's worth flagging. On January 24th, while the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles were out of the line and back at Battalion, 350 of their men were assembled to witness a demonstration of a captured German Flamethrower. The Canadians wanted them to see the weapon, to hear it work, to understand its range and its sound, so they might know what they might face. 5 months later, some of those same men would face it for real. In April 1916, the 3rd Canadian Division takes over its section of the salient. Their position includes Montsorel, Hills 61 and 62, Sanctuary Wood, and Observatory Ridge. This is a stretch of ground that offers the Canadians and whoever holds it commanding views across a significant portion of the salient. It is tactically valuable ground, which means the Germans want it. Now, if you listen to the episode we did on the Battle of Montsorel about 2 months ago, you already know how this fight unfolds. The 11 days, the counterattack, Byng's deliberate planning, the recovery of the ground. We're not going to cover all of that again here. What we are going to do is look specifically at the Flamethrowers' role in the opening of that battle, because June 2nd, 1916 is the moment the weapon meets the CEF at scale. And the official record on this, Colonel G.W.L. Nicholson's Canadian Expeditionary Force 1914 to 1919, published by the Department of National Defense in 1962, is unambiguous. The German operation is meticulously prepared. For weeks, German artillery has been registering on Canadian positions. Pioneer teams have pushed forward saps to within yards of the Canadian line. Tunneling companies have been mining under the forward trenches. So the German assault force is 2 divisions of the 8th, the Württemberg Corps, the 26th and 27th Infantry Divisions. They're supported by the 117th Division on the southern flank. The lead infantry units are specific. There's 2 battalions each of Infantry Regiment 121 and Infantry Regiment 125 of the 26th Division on the right, and 2 battalions of the Infantry Regiment 120 of the 27th Division on the left at Montsorel itself. 5 more battalions in support, 6 in reserve, more than 6,500 men in the assault waves. And attached to those assault formations, pioneer teams equipped with flame projectors. Now the Canadian position. The forward trenches on Montsorel and Hill 61, they're numbered 47 to 53, are held by the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles. To their left, holding trenches 54 through 60, are the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles. To the north, in Sanctuary Wood, the PPCLI under Lieutenant Colonel Buller. To the right, the 5th Battalion of the 1st Canadian Division under Lieutenant Colonel Tuxford. Behind the front line at Maple Copse, the 5th CMR under Lieutenant Colonel Baker in brigade support. At 6 o'clock on the morning of June 2nd, Brigadier Generals Mercer and Williams reach the 4th CMR's forward trench. The bombardment opens immediately. Lord Beaverbrook's official account, quote, the heaviest endured by British troops up to that time, end quote. For 4 hours, what Nicholson calls a veritable tornado of fire ravages the Canadian positions. The 4th CMR's trenches simply cease to exist. Nicholson, Official History, page 149, quote, their trenches vanished and the garrisons in them were annihilated, end quote. A German officer watching from across no man's land would later write that the Canadian position was, quote, a cloud of dust and dirt into which timber, tree trunks, weapons, and equipment were continuously hurled up and occasionally human bodies, end quote. Mercer is hit. His eardrums shatter from near shell burst. A bullet breaks his leg. As he lies in the open, attempting to get back to his headquarters, a burst of shrapnel kills him. Williams is wounded. He takes shelter in a tunnel, a gallery dug into the reverse slope of Montreal by the 2nd Canadian Tunnelling Company. The tunnel holds for a while, then it doesn't. When the German infantry overruns the position later that afternoon, Williams and the other surviving occupants of the collapsed tunnel are taken prisoner. For several critical hours, both the 3rd Division and the 8th Brigade are leaderless. Brigadier General E.S. Hornairn of the Lahore Divisional Artillery eventually assumes temporary command. Lieutenant Colonel J.C.L. Bott of the 2nd CMR takes over the brigade, but by the time those divisions reach the troops, the position has effectively been destroyed. Now back at Maple Copse, the 5th CMR is trying to understand what's happening to the battalion in front of them. The bombardment, which has expanded back to engulf their support position, makes communication impossible. The War Diary records the moment, quote, at about 8:30 a.m., enemy began a very heavy bombardment on the front line and all the ground in Maple Copse and vicinity, end quote. That's the bombardment intensifying and extending. The front line had been under fire since 6 a.m. The 5th CMR sends runners forward. They don't make it. Quote, runners sent out by us with this end in view were either killed or returned wounded, with news that the communication trenches had been blown in and that it was impossible to get through enemy's barrage fire, end quote. Then, at 9:15, 2 men from the 4th CMR get through. They carry a message from Captain J.H. Simmons, adjutant of the 4th CMR. Quote, our wires are cut. Please have corps artillery turned on. General Mercer is here and wants it. General Williams has been hit, end quote. In 11 words of military shorthand, it tells you the divisional commander is in the wreckage of a forward battalion that is being destroyed, asking for artillery support while his brigade commander has just gone down beside him. That message is the sound of a division coming apart in real time. To the north, the PPCLI is in Sanctuary Wood, and to the south, the 5th Battalion of the 1st Canadian Division are not the targets of flame projectors. They are the flanks. Their machine guns rake the German attackers as they advance across the captured ground, inflicting heavy casualties and ultimately helping to break the German momentum. The PPCLI pay terribly for that defense, roughly 400 casualties, including 150 killed. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Cecil Buller, is shot down while directing his men. The PPCLI didn't face liquid fire. They faced the artillery and the infantry assault, but they held the flank long enough that the German breakthrough didn't become a breakout. The salient survived because they held. Behind the broken front line, the 5th CMR at Maple Copse is fighting its own version of this morning. The commanding officer moves his headquarters into the communication trench as the dugouts collapse under shell fire. Captain Pitto, ordered to reinforce a strong point with 2 platoons, is mortally wounded attempting it. Company Sergeant Major Gill takes charge of another strong point and holds it until, as the War Diary records, his force was practically wiped out. The Germans used smoke bombs to screen their attacks on the eastern and southeastern perimeter of the Copse. The 5th CMR fires into the smoke anyway. Nicholson notes that they checked the German attacks on maple copse with rapid and accurate fire. When the 5th CMR comes out of the line on June 3rd, they muster 325 rank and file from nearly 650 who went in. 12 officers remain. 6 of those 12 came out of the actual fighting. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel G.H. Baker, is dead. His men bury him at Poppering on June 4th with full military honors. The War Diary's epitaph for him, written by men who have just endured 48 hours of this, quote, "He died as he wished, at the head of his men, and his cross in the new military cemetery at Poppering is inscribed, 'Killed in action,' the epitaph of a man," end quote. There's no self-pity in that sentence. There's grief, but it's the grief of the soldiers, plain, direct, looking for meaning in the manner of death rather than the fact of it. The Germans take Montserrat. They take Tortop. They take Hill 61. They push to within 600 yards of their objective, and then, inexplicably, they stop. They begin to consolidate the ground they've taken instead of pushing on, even though the road to Ypres is open behind them. No one will ever fully explain why. The salient survives in part because of that German hesitation and in part because the Canadians on the flanks held when they could have been broken. But the high ground is gone, and the weapon that helped clear out the last Canadian resistance pockets, flame projectors, carried by German pioneer teams across the smashed trenches of the 4th and 1st CMR, has announced itself to the Canadian Corps in the most direct way possible. Andrew Bain served with the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. It was a Scottish line regiment that put 15 battalions into the field over the course of the war. He was on the Western Front through the worst of it. He gave his testimony decades later to the Imperial War Museum. Here's Bain.
Flamethrower. They were terrifying. We managed to drive them back by nailing the crews, shooting at the crews. But as they came on, they really were terrible. This just a sheet of flame coming in front, you see, and smoke and that sort of thing. And the German crews sort of going on behind, feeding the thing up. And the only way to stop them was to kill off the crews. And we managed to stop them before they really got into our trenches, but it was rather terrifying to see them coming.
Now, while the Canadians are absorbing the lessons of June 2nd, British engineers are putting the finishing touches on their own answer to the flamethrower problem. The answer is characteristically British, which is to say ambitious, innovative, enormous, and not entirely practical. William Livens is a Royal Engineers officer with the gift for unconventional solutions and, depending on which source you believe, personal grudge against the German army that may go back to the sinking of the Lusitania. Whatever the motivation, the result is one of the most ambitious flame weapons ever built. He designs what he calls the large gallery flame projector. These things are enormous. Each weapon is 56 feet long, weighs 2.5 tons, built in sections that have to be hauled to the front line and assembled piece by piece inside a shallow tunnel, otherwise known as a sap, pushed forward under no man's land to within about 60 yards of the German trench. It takes a carrying party of 300 men to move one of these things up to the line and put it together. 300 men for a single weapon. When it works, and that's the operative word, the projector pushes its nozzle up through the earth on a pneumatic cylinder. Compressed gas drives a piston forward in the main body, and a torrent of burning oil arcs across no man's land at a range of about 300 feet or 90 meters, far beyond anything the German portable units can achieve. 3 10-second bursts. That's all the fuel allows, but 3 10-second bursts is enough to drown a section of German front trench in fire. The concept is tactically sound. Use the projectors at the moment of assault to suppress German defenders, clear the forward trench, and create the window the infantry needs to cross and enter the German line. Replicate the effect of Hooge, but bigger. And for the British side, 4 projectors are built and hauled up for the opening day of the Battle of the Somme. Their target date is July 1st, 1916. And here, the story splits in 4 different directions, one for each weapon, and it is super interesting. 2 of the 4 are destroyed by German artillery before they can fire. The Germans have spotted the construction activity. You can't move 300 men and 2.5 tons of machinery into a shallow tunnel without leaving signs. And their counter-battery fire collapses the saps before the British can use what they've built. One of the 2 that do fire both deploy from saps near Carnoy, immediately adjacent to the mine crater field. And in those specific local sectors, the projectors do exactly what Livens designed them to do. The flame clears a section of German trench. Defenders are forced back or burned out. By one report, 50 German soldiers immediately surrender at the sight of the weapon. British infantry casualties in those local sectors are notably low compared to the catastrophe unfolding elsewhere along the Somme front that morning. But it doesn't matter because the broader assault is collapsing. The local tactical window opened by the flame projectors cannot be exploited when the units that should follow up are being slaughtered by machine gun fire half a mile away. The 2 functioning projectors do their job, and the war goes on. And then there is the 4th. The 4th Livens large gallery flame projector is in a sap at Montagne-Capi near Mametz in late June 1916. The carrying parties have hauled the sections up. The crews are partway through assembly. And then a German shell, one of the countless thousands falling on the Somme front in the days before July 1st, strikes the sap and collapses it. The tunnel goes in. The weapon, partially assembled, is buried. Nobody digs it up. The opening day of the Somme arrives. The battle moves on. The position is lost, retaken, lost, retaken again. The war ends. The decades pass. The farmer, who eventually owns the field above, probably has no idea what is sleeping under his crops. In May 2010, 94 years after that German shell collapsed the sap, a team of historians and archaeologists from the University of Glasgow's Centre for Battlefield Archaeology, working with the Royal Engineers and a Channel 4 documentary crew for Time Team, opens an exploratory trench at Montagne-Capi. They have the regimental war diaries. They have the trench maps. They know roughly where to look. They find it. SAP 14, the collapsed tunnel, the Livens large gallery flame projector, or what's left of it, exactly where the Royal Engineers were assembling it in June 1916. The gate valve, the delivery head, 1.3 meters of extension pipe, monitor clamps, spanners, tools laid down by men who fully expected to come back the next morning and finish the job. They never came back. The sap caved in and the weapon waited in the dark for 94 years. It is, in a way, the perfect physical artifact of the Livens projector story. It's a piece of British tactical ambition frozen in mid-construction by exactly the vulnerability that doomed the concept in the first place. Too big to hide, too fragile to survive, and buried by a single German shell on a battlefield where shells fell by the millions. The British draw the right conclusion from the Somme experience, even without knowing about the buried 4th weapon. The large static projector is too vulnerable, it's too inflexible, and too dependent on everything else going right. The concept of offensive flame isn't abandoned. Livens himself will go on to develop far more effective Livens projector for delivering gas shells, one of the genuinely innovative weapons of the war's later stages. but the large flame weapon is quietly shelved. The German portable model remains dominant, and as 1916 becomes 1917, the weapon and the tactics around it continue to evolve. So let's kind of pick apart what's happening across the German army in 1917 in order to understand the flamethrower's role. It's sort of a shift that goes well beyond any single weapon. The Germans are developing what we now call stormtrooper tactics, so small, autonomous assault teams that bypass strong points, exploit gaps, and rely on speed and disruption rather than mass. Artillery is no longer preparation for assault, it's fire support during the assault. The barrage moves and the infantry moves with it. In this framework, the flamethrower actually finds its natural home. So Redemann's unit, the Guard Reserve Pioneer Regiment, formally established in April of 1916, is no longer just a flamethrower force. It's become a specialist assault force. Its teams carry grenades, light machine guns, trench mortars, and flame, each with a specific tactical purpose, all working together. So to set the scene now, let's think about 3rd Ypres, also known as Passchendaele. And that battle went from July to November 1917. The British and Dominion assault on the ridge east of Ypres. The terrain is uniquely terrible. Waterlogged clay, shell craters filled with water and mud, God knows what else, and almost no defined trench line. But within that chaos, the Germans have built a system of concrete pillboxes and fortified farmhouses, providing mutually supporting fire. It's a new defensive architecture adapted to the conditions and to the German doctrine of elastic defense. The CEF takes over the final phase in October 1917. So the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Canadian Divisions attack in sequence, October 26th, October 30th, November 6th, November 10th, and they take the ridge. The cost is appalling. The ground is a charnel house, and German flamethrower teams are part of what makes it so expensive in that sense. At Passchendaele, the flamethrower isn't deployed in the classic Hooge configuration, the deliberate, prepared assault with fixed projectors. The conditions just don't allow for it. Instead, Canadian soldiers encounter flame in sudden, close-range moments, in some ways more terrifying than a planned attack because there's no warning. A pillbox that seemed silenced opens up with a jet of burning oil at 20 meters. A German counterattack emerges from a concrete strongpoint with cleave operators leading. The ground, already a maze of mucky craters and shattered duckboards, offers no cover when fire enters the equation. I want to pause here for a moment and let you listen to the voice of Mr. Roy Henley. He was born in London, Ontario on September 29, 1898, after enlisting in Toronto in 1916 with the 166th Queen's Own Rifles. He was discharged, actually, with suspected tuberculosis. He re-enlisted, sailed to England, and joined the Quebec Regiment. Mr. Henley's recollections are detailed, sometimes graphic, and occasionally quite humorous. His experiences spanned many battles, the Somme, Vimy Ridge, Passchendaele, Cambrai, and Arras. And I just want to pause and insert his voice here. Even though he is not talking about flamethrowers, he's talking about the other horrors of war that would have been going on simultaneously with the flamethrowers. So here's Roy Henley.
He had his jaw blown off by the same bunch of grenades that caught me. 6 potato mashers tied to a piece of wood. You see, the potato masher, you unscrewed the end, and a little porcelain knob come out on a string. You untied these 6 after they were tied around to a piece of wood, long enough to make a handle. And then you tied all these little knobs together, one bunch, these cords, And then when you're trying to blast a trench, the German simply pulled a bunch of and threw it right in amongst you. Well, it was one hell of an explosion. 6 of those potato mashers, which each of them was a heck of a real bad, but that's what they used. We got caught on that. Top lost his jaw. I had my legs shattered. I had a few odd pieces.
Now, by 1917, the Canadian Corps has trained explicit responses. The doctrine is simple and brutal. Kill the operator before he gets into range. The Cleef's maximum effective range is 18 meters, give or take. Engage him at 30 meters or more, you win. Let him close to 15, you almost certainly lose. Lewis gunners, snipers, section commanders, all of them know this calculation. The problem at Passchendaele is that the ground itself defeats it. In a lunar landscape of craters and mud, 30 meters of clear line of sight is a luxury. Encounters happen fast, at close range, and aimed fire on the operator requires steadiness under the most primal terror a soldier can experience. They did that repeatedly. They were frightened. You cannot watch a jet of liquid fire come toward you in a Belgian mud crater and not be frightened. But they functioned. They maintained fire discipline. They advanced. That is not a small thing. If Passchendaele shows the flamethrower as a defensive tool in difficult terrain, the German Spring Offensive of March 1918 shows it at its most fully developed and reveals its ceiling. So here we are, March 21st, 1918, Operation Michael. The Spring Offensive is the culmination of everything the German army has learned. A massive, concentrated assault on a narrow front designed to break through the Allied line before American forces arrive in numbers large enough to matter. Now remember, the Americans had not yet entered the First World War until the spring of 1918. The preliminary bombardment is short, intense, and precisely targeted at communications headquarters and artillery rather than frontline infantry. Then the stormtroopers, the German stormtroopers, go forward in the morning mist. Flamethrower teams from the Guard Reserve Pioneer Regiment are integrated into the assault formations at multiple points. Their role? Clear British positions that survive the bombardment, flush defenders out of strong points, provide squad-level fire support when the advance hits unexpected resistance. The tactical integration is sophisticated in a way the clumsy deployments of 1914 would be unrecognizable. These are not shock weapons for psychological effects. They are tools in a combined arms system refined over 3 years of brutal trial and error. Between March and July 1918, the Guard Reserve Pioneer Regiment makes 105 separate flamethrower attacks. That tells you something about the operational tempo. The offensive breaks through. The Germans advance further in a single day than any day's gain since 1914. The British Fifth Army is pushed back dramatically. The tactical system works. The flamethrower, as part of that system, works. Again, now I want you to listen to a couple of veterans' voices. These are voices of the British Expeditionary Force. First one we're going to listen to is Edward Glendinning. He was 17 years old, a clerk in civilian life when he enlisted in 1913. By February 1915, he was a private with the 5th Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters. He served through some of the worst of it, eventually rising to corporal. He came home, lived a long life, and in 1963, he sat down with the BBC to talk about what he'd seen for the Great War series. His voice would later turn up again in Peter Jackson's documentary, They Shall Not Grow Old. A teenage enlistee still speaking from beyond the grave, still describing the trenches. Here's Glendinning.
Well, the hours wore on and it became dusk, and then we heard rattling and rustling behind us. We wondered whatever this could be. And strong detachments of the guards managed to get in and were taking our places. They relieved us in much greater strength than we'd been all day, whereas we'd been about one man to about 10 yards of trench. They had a man every couple of feet. Well, word was passed along for the Sherwood foresters to assemble in groups and to withdraw. Well, of course, as we withdrew over the ground that had been captured that day, the sight was incredible. It was just like a flock of sheep lying asleep in a field. And it became evident that the regimental stretcher bearers, who one time had been bandsmen, had been unable to cope with such a huge number of casualties. Quite a number of the men were still alive, and they were crying out and begging for water. They plucked at our legs as we went by. One hefty chap did grab me by round both legs and held me. And I was going to take the cork out of my hot water bottle, out of my water bottle, to give him a drink. And I was immediately prodded on behind by someone saying, get on, we're going to lose touch with the column in front. We shall get lost. In the years that have passed, that man's pleadings have haunted me. Yes, it was a dreadful experience, there's no doubt about that. Still, those of us who survived think ourselves jolly lucky.
So while I'm sitting here talking about the breakthrough and how it works, there are men like Ed Glendinning who are out in the field during Passchendaele witnessing all of this, and worse. So the breakthrough doesn't become a war-winning rupture. 3 reasons, all interconnected. First, the Germans advanced too far for their own supply lines to keep pace. Stormtrooper tactics are built for speed and penetration, not for the logistical grinding that deep exploitation requires. Second, the Allied response, improvised, expensive, but effective, plugs the gaps. Canadian units are rushed south to stabilize the line. The Canadian Corps, which German planners had specifically tried to avoid because of its reputation, ends up in the path of multiple German drives anyway. And third, and this is the piece that matters most for our story, is that by 1918, the flamethrower has lost its most powerful attribute: surprise. Every Allied soldier on the Western Front by 1918 has either faced a flamethrower, trained against one, or been briefed on what to do when one appears. The weapon that broke the Rifle Brigade at Hooge in 1915 by producing a kind of paralysis, a freezing of the tactical mind in the face of something unprecedented, is no longer unprecedented. Allied soldiers are still frightened. Of course they are. Fire is fire. But they can function through the fear. They follow their training. Shoot the operator, don't let him close, move laterally, and use cover. Simple responses, but they work well enough, often enough, to strip the flamethrower of the decisive tactical edge Redeman had built his entire doctrine around. By summer 1918, the 100 Days Offensive is underway. The Allied counterattack, with the Canadian Corps at its spearhead for 4 of its most important operations, pushes the Germans back toward the November armistice. The Guard Reserve Pioneer Regiment is fighting in that retreat too, using flame to defend as well as attack. But the initiative has shifted. The strategic situation is collapsing, and no tactical weapon is going to change that. Once again now, let's listen to a veteran voice or two. I'd like to introduce Mr. William Easton. He was a stretcher bearer with the Royal Army Medical Corps, again with the BEF, first with the 75th and then the 77th Field Ambulance, attached to the 25th Division. He'd lied about his age to enlist in 1914. In March 1918, during the German Spring Offensive, the 25th Division was overrun. Easton was actually taken prisoner. He was beaten with a rifle butt during interrogation, survived only because a British officer intervened, and from there he was put to work doing what he had always done, which was caring for the wounded, except now the wounded were Germans. He worked in a German field hospital in Belgium. The staff and patients started calling him Kleiner Engländer, which is the little Englishman. They made him an honorary sergeant. At one point, he sang Tipperary at a hospital party with the German nurses joining in. Bizarre. He came home in 1918, and he gave his testimony decades later to the Imperial War Museum. Here's Easton.
I got carted off. They put us in a field, and we hadn't been there long, and a voice said, if there's anybody knows how to deal with wounded, we'd be very pleased if they'd volunteer to go in the church, which has had quite a number of wounded in there for 6 days. We've done what we could, but we've got our own people to look at. So I said, I'll go. All the length of this place, it was nothing but people laying on the floor. British. I started on them. And at any rate, the next morning, the sergeant came, and he came up there. He said to me, my first mission, he said, is to thank you on behalf of my commanding officer. He said, and if he was here himself, he'd like to shake your hand for volunteering to do this job.
Now, at this point, since we're talking about medical corps, stretcher bearers, that type of thing, we're going to hear from another British veteran, Alfred Irwin, properly Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Percy Irwin. He was a career officer with the East Surrey Regiment in uniform since 1909. By June 1916, he was commanding the 8th Battalion, BEF. A week later, he led them over the top on the first day of the Somme. If the regiment's name rings a bell, it's because of Irwin's company commander, Billy Neville, the officer who kicked footballs across no man's land that morning on Irwin's authority. Neville was killed within minutes. By nightfall, the battalion had come down from 800 men to under 200. Irwin survived. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order 3 times before the war ended, and he gave his testimony to BBC for the Great War series in the early 1960s. Here's Irwin talking about Canadian stretcher bearers.
We took part in the assault on the Zaha Trench, and in the morning before it got light, I went up to have a look around this new ground we'd taken. And I went round with the company commander and was very pleased with what he'd done. And just as it was getting light, started off back to my battalion headquarters. And I hadn't gone more than a few yards before I was shot in the thigh. And I fell into a shell hole full of water. It was freezing hard, full of water and ice. And every time I raised my head to try and put a bandage on my leg, the sniper had another go at me. So I had to lie in the water and just wait for help, which did come in the form of Canadian stretcher bearers. But my unfortunate orderly, whom I thought I was doing the best I could for him, I told him to go on when I was hit. That's to say, to go back. Was hit on the way back and died. But I came through because I was lifted out by Canadian stretcher bearers later in the morning.
Now, the flamethrowers moment, its genuine moment of tactical dominance, is really 1915 to early 1918. 3 years. Long enough to kill thousands of men and reshape how armies think about close assault. Not long enough, in the end, to decide the war. So what do we take away from this? A few things, I think, that go beyond the hardware. The first is about tactical innovation and how it actually works under pressure. Redeman didn't invent a new weapon. Fiedler did that, and the Byzantines did it 1,200 years before either of them. What Redeman invented was a way of thinking about an existing weapon that transformed it from failed experiment into something that reshaped tactics on the most intensely studied battlefield in history. He understood that the problem wasn't the flamethrower, the problem was the doctrine, and he spent years working against institutional skepticism, limited resources, and outright opposition from those who had seen the 1914 failures, building the unit, the training, and the methods that made the weapon viable. That's how tactical innovation usually works in war, not a single flash of genius. It's an interpretive process of use, failure, analysis, adaptation, and refinement. The Germans got there first with the flamethrower in this war, and the Allies had the costly luxury of learning from the German mistakes. The Livens projector is a perfect example. Takes the German concept, scales it up to British proportions, and then discovers the hard way at the Somme that a fixed 2.5-ton weapon in an advanced SAP has a vulnerability that the man carrying a backpack does not. The second thing is about the relationship between terror and tactics. Redelman was explicit that the flamethrower's primary value was psychological. The moral shock was more important, in his view, than the physical damage, and he was right in the short term. The first time soldiers faced the flamethrower at Malincourt, at Hooge, at Montsorel, the psychological effect was devastating. It produced exactly the paralysis Redelman had theorized. But terror has a half-life. By 1917, by 1918, Allied soldiers who have survived flamethrower attacks or trained intensively against them have developed the cognitive tools to resist the panic. They're still frightened. You would always be. They can function through the fear. The weapon that broke the rifle brigade at Hooge in 1915 is a managed, if still dangerous, threat by 1918. Which brings us to the third thing, and the one that matters most when we think about the CEF specifically. The Canadians were not the innovators here. They were the recipients, the men on the receiving end of a weapon used to clear out the last pockets of resistance in their forward trenches at Montsorel, against a division that was still finding its feet. The 1st CMR, the 4th CMR, the 5th CMR, the PPCLI, the 8th Canadian Infantry Brigade was gutted on June 2nd, 1916. Lieutenant Colonel Baker is dead. Lieutenant Colonel Buller is dead. General Mercer is dead in a trench he had no tactical obligation to be in, except that he was the kind of officer who went where his men were. And the Canadians' response to that, the refusal to counterattack reflexively, the deliberate replanning, the recovery of the ground on June 13th, is itself a tactical lesson of the first order. The instinct in any military organization after a humiliating loss is to do something fast to restore honor and momentum. Byng resisted that. He took 11 days. He did it right. There's a straight line, if you look for it, between the lessons absorbed at Hooge and Montsorel and the way the Canadian Corps fights in the final year of the war. The tactical sophistication that makes the CEF one of the most effective fighting formations on the Western Front by 1917 and 1918 was built in part on exactly these painful, expensive encounters. Fire was the teacher. The Canadians paid the tuition, and they graduated. Next, I want you to listen to a voice, a veteran voice, from the other side. This is Stefan Westman. He was a German infantryman in 1914, serving with the 113th Baden Infantry Regiment on the Western Front. Later in the war, he became a medical officer, treating casualties on both sides. He survived. He went on to become a professor of medicine at the University of Berlin, then fled the Nazis in the 1930s and ended up practicing on Harley Street in London, England. By the Second World War, he was wearing a British uniform, honorary colonel, Royal Army Medical Corps. A long, strange life. In 1963, the BBC sat down with him for their landmark series, The Great War, and asked him to talk about what he'd seen. Here's Westman.
I wandered through the casemates, and there I found one casemate bricked up. and on that casemate somebody had written, "Here lie 1,052 German soldiers." I asked what that meant. So they told me that 1,052 German soldiers was in that casemate, and in the same casemate they had stored barrels of fluid, of fuel for the flamethrowers. Somebody must have been very careless, and the whole thing blew up, and nobody was left. They couldn't even get at them, so they bricked up that casemate and put down that there were 1,052 German soldiers.
So sometimes even the best planning in war doesn't work out the way one has hoped. General Malcolm Mercer did not die instantly on June 2nd, 1916, at Montserrat. He survived the bombardment, wounded, deafened, but moving. He made it briefly to safety, and then, in the way of the man, he tried to get back to his headquarters. He was hit again in the open, his leg shattered by a bullet, then a burst of shrapnel, and that was that. He died in or near Armagh Wood, in the wreckage of the position his division was supposed to be holding. Nobody who knew where he was made it back to Allied lines to say so. For 19 days, the Canadian Corps didn't know for certain whether their divisional commander was dead or a prisoner. It was only on June 21st, after the ground had been retaken, after the fighting had moved on, that a Canadian burial party worked its way through a sector of trench in Armagh Wood and found 30 bodies. One of them was identifiable only by his uniform decoration. That was how they found Malcolm Mercer. There is one more detail worth mentioning because it sits in the record and refuses to go away quietly. A staff officer later concluded that the shell which had killed him was British in origin. How that conclusion was reached is unclear, and it's never been definitively resolved. Whether it was German fire or Allied fire that finally brought him down in that smashed and burning ground where everything was chaos and the shells were falling from every direction, it almost doesn't matter. What matters is that he was there because he went where his men were, as he always did. Mercer was buried at Leesenthal Military Cemetery with full military honors on June 24, 1916. His division turned out for him. So did officers from across the Canadian Corps and the British Army, men who had worked alongside him and knew what they were losing. He was posthumously mentioned in dispatches by General Haig, the third time he had been so honored. Malcolm Mercer remains the most senior Canadian officer killed in action in any war Canada has fought. The 1st and 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, the two battalions that took the brunt of the bombardment, the assault and the flame projectors on June 2nd, were rebuilt. They went back into the line. They fought at Passchendaele and through the 100 Days. The 5th CMR came out of Maple Copse with 325 men and buried their colonel with full honors and wrote in their war diary that he died as he wished, at the head of his men. They went back in too. The Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, who held the flank in Sanctuary Wood at terrible cost, lost their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Buller, and helped save the salient that day, are still a regiment. They have been continuously serving since 1914. That fact is worth sitting with for a moment. Mount Buller, located in the Kananaskis mountain range of Alberta, Canada, not far from here, was officially named in his honor in 1922. The flamethrower outlived the war. It shows up in the next one, and the one after that, in different shapes and different scales, but recognizably descended from what Redmond's firemen carried into the trenches of France and Flanders more than a century ago. The Treaty of Versailles formally banned it, paragraph 171, for whatever that was worth. And somewhere in a French field near Mametz, beneath the soil of Montague de Capi, the place where they pulled the 4th Livens projector out of the ground in 2010, sits quiet again. The crops grow back. The tools are catalogued. The story finally is told. But in the story of the First World War, and in the story of the CEF specifically, the flamethrower's legacy is not really about the weapon. It's about what soldiers do when they face something designed at a fundamental level to make them stop being soldiers, to strip away training and doctrine and tactical thinking and reduce them for a few terrible seconds to just frightened human beings in a burning trench. The answer, not always, but enough times in enough places, is that they adapt, they think, they hold, and then they keep going. I want to thank you for joining me for this episode of Memory and Valor and the exploration of flamethrowers as a weapon of war, a psychological weapon, and just the evolution of the weapon itself. I had no idea that this thing went back 1,200 years or 1,300 years, so that's the great thing about this podcast is in my research, I always learn something new. And I hope that you have too. I hope that you can take something away from this episode today that makes you think, that makes you wonder, that maybe you'll pass on a story to someone in your family, young people, and surprise them a little bit, maybe spark their interest in the First World War as well. So until next time, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.